Even though Lucius Clay never fought in combat, he would become one of the most influential generals in the United States military. He was born in Marietta, Georgia on April 23, 1897, went on to graduate from West Point, and eventually became a military engineer, responsible for building over 500 military airfields. His construction experience qualified him to lead rebuilding a nation destroyed in war. Clay's finest hours of leadership would come during his time as military governor in Germany. During World War II, the Germans committed some of the worst crimes in history. After the war, many officials in Washington felt the Germans could not be trusted to have a democratic government. At the same time, many Germans, especially Berliners, had reason to show animosity towards Americans who had bombed their cities from the air. The feelings of distrust and hatred between the Germans and the Allies were evident when Clay arrived in mid-1945. Heinz Nephi Kupitz was a 14-year-old young man living in East Berlin at the end of World War II.
And Berlin was destroyed a lot. Roads, the streetcars, you know. I mean, you couldn't depend on it.
Germans had embraced Nazism, had participated in the beginning of World War II, and had been the people on the ground perpetuating, one of the greatest crimes in history, in the Holocaust. And so there was a lot of questioning on the side of the Allies. Well, what do you do with a people who can do that kind of thing? What do you do with the Germans after the war? So that there were a lot of people who thought, oh, there's nothing you can do. We have to quarantine these people, because in the minds of a lot of Americans, the Germans had started World War I, in fact, started World War II, and had done terrible things, and it wasn't really clear, what do you do at that point?
The victorious Allies split up Germany into 4 occupation zones in order to try to prevent another world war. The Soviets occupied the eastern part of Germany, while the French, Americans, and British occupied the western part. Berlin was Germany's largest city and capital, thus it was also split into 4 sectors. Berlin was situated over 100 miles deep in the Soviet occupation zone, and had been dependent on East Germany historically for food. A formal agreement had been made that allowed the Western Allies access to 3 air corridors from West Germany into West Berlin. However, the agreement for shipments by road, rail, or canal was only verbal. This would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. When Clay arrived in Berlin, he was shocked by the condition of the city. In his autobiography, he stated, "It was like a city of the dead. I must confess that my exultation in victory was diminished as I witnessed this degradation of man. I decided then and there never to forget that we were responsible for the government of human beings." Clay was the right person for the job because he brought more than just his engineering skills to his responsibilities as military governor.
And so Clay was one of the first people among officials to say, well, actually, and this is mostly as a result of being in Germany and trying to rebuild the country afterwards and being in charge of the occupation. He was one of the first to say, no, there's a real future here for the Germans. We can rehabilitate these people, and they can eventually join what he would have called the family of countries.
Made Clay so great, he was tough. He stayed to the policies that required our national objectives in Europe for our nation, how we wanted Europe to end up, and he was like a bulldog.
The Soviets met their match with Clay, and Stalin was learning he would have to do something dramatic to get Americans out of Berlin. He continued to disrupt shipments into Berlin, and eventually on August 4th, 1948, the Soviets completely blocked all canals, roadways, and railroads going into West Berlin. There were many military and political leaders who believed retreating from Berlin was now their only option, but Clay insisted on the importance of staying in Berlin. During one of his frequent phone conversations with the Army Chief of Staff, Omar Bradley, Clay strongly stated, "If we mean to hold Europe against communism, we must not budge. If we withdraw, our position in Europe is threatened. If America does not understand this now, does not know what the issue is cast, then it never will, and communism will run rampant. I believe the future of democracy requires us to stay."
And Clay felt very strongly that the Soviets were bluffing. He did not think that they would risk a war. Clay understood better than I think most of the other people who were involved in the American government at the time is exactly what the Soviets were up to. I mean, that was always the big question at the end of World War II is, what are the guys over there thinking? What are the Russians thinking?
He quickly realized the urgency of the situation in Berlin and made immediate plans to begin an airlift to supply the city with some food and other necessities. The success of his forceful personality and conviction for staying in Berlin energized the U.S. Air Force and the British to start a full-fledged airlift. The question then became, would Berliners hold on or give in to Soviet promises for food in return for turning away from the West? The results of the initial airlift were encouraging to Clay, but it seemed clear to many they could only carry a fraction of what was required to feed and provide coal to 2.5 million people.
When he landed in Berlin with a load of 20,000 pounds of flour, and the Germans came on that airplane to unload it and went back at us like angels from heaven. And there were people that were trying to kill us, and we trying to kill them just 2 years before.
Clay's commitment and insight for helping the German people sent a strong signal to Allied forces and Berliners as well. He was able to keep his military and civilian workers motivated even though the task was almost impossible. This atmosphere of compassionate service was demonstrated in a selfless act by a young pilot flying one of the many newly arrived C-54 airplanes. Lieutenant Gail Halverson's candy drops proved to be an important element in gaining the support of the West Berliners that was greatly needed.
I wanted to give him something. I filled my pocket and I had 2 sticks of gum. Broke it in half. And a little voice coming back to the room, the decision should make. Come back to that, I said, well, the 2 sticks of gum, you got 30 kids, you're going to have a fight, boys and girls. I mean, you can't do any good with 2 sticks of gum, get out of here. You're already feeding them, that's enough. And right at that moment, a voice came to me, clear as can be, when it said, go back to the fence. It was just that vicinity. Go back to the fence. So it wasn't me, it was those kids.
Heinz Kupitz personally witnessed the joy Halverson's candy drops brought to the children of Berlin.
We came so low over the apartment houses that I thought he took the chimneys with. And I watched that once, you know. I went to the West Berlin, to Tempelhof. I thought it was summer. That is interesting. I have time, so I went out and watched that from a railroad station. And I saw suddenly lots of kids screaming, you know. I thought, what did they scream for? And then came that airplane, you know, waving a little bit. And then the parachutes, you know. Then they talked about the candy bomb.
Halverson's efforts soon expanded into 23 tons of candy to be distributed. This was seen by Germans as proof that Americans cared about them. Under Clay's leadership, the airlift was able to provide West Berliners with over 2 million tons of food and supplies. The airlift response to the blockade became such a positive public relations boost for the U.S. that it forced the Soviets to call off the blockade on May 11, 1949. The Germans certainly suffered during the blockade, but years later they look back with gratitude at what the Americans had done as fulfillment of a deep trust and commitment. This would be especially true as Berliners watched the Soviets build a wall separating the East from the West in 1961. Clay's legacy will always be that his firmness stopped the Russian expanse while laying the foundation for a future Germany that was reunited after the Berlin Wall fell in 1989. From that time forward, the almost inconceivable achievement of a unified democratic Germany proved the wisdom and foresight of General Clay. He led America to support Berlin at a crucial time in history. He was the man who saved a city, a nation, and perhaps a continent.